What if the love you've been searching for has been here all along? Not out there in someone's eyes, not in a perfect moment waiting on the horizon, not in the applause you imagine will make you finally feel worthy, but here, in the quiet space beneath your breath, in the still point at the center of your chest, in a place you may have forgotten to look. Most of us spend our lives in motion. We run toward careers, toward relationships, toward achievements, and away from loneliness, away from shame, away from anything that threatens to slow us down. We move as if the finish line holds the key to our peace. And yet, haven't you noticed? The faster you run, the further that feeling seems to drift. It's like chasing a small, beautiful bird through the forest. You hear the flutter of its wings, you glimpse its colors between the trees, but every time you lunge forward, it darts away, just out of reach. You start thinking, if only I could grab it, I'd finally have what I need. And so the chase becomes your life. But in the teachings of the Buddha, there's another way. They say, sit down, place your hands in your lap, let your breath rise and fall without force. In the stillness, the bird will return on its own. It might even land in your open palm, because love, like that bird, is drawn not to grasping but to presence. Somewhere deep inside, you may already feel the truth of this, that all the noise and striving is just a veil, and behind it there's a tenderness you've been carrying since the very beginning. You don't have to earn it, you don't have to chase it. You only have to stop running long enough to notice. And once you do, once you catch even the smallest glimpse, something shifts. The tension in your chest softens. The inner critic's voice fades into the background. For the first time in a long while, you're not standing outside your own life, begging to be let in. You are home. It begins here with a single question that might change everything. If the love you've been seeking has always been yours, what would it feel like to finally receive it? When you pause long enough to feel the stillness, you might notice something else, a restlessness. A subtle pull inside, whispering, go, move, find, prove. It's the same current that has been carrying you for years. Sometimes it feels like ambition, other times like hunger, and sometimes it's pure desperation. The Buddha called it tanha, craving, that tightening in the chest that insists, when I get there, I'll finally be enough. But here's the hidden truth. Craving is a master of disguise. It doesn't just lure us with promises of more. It convinces us that without more, we are less, so we chase. We chase affection, recognition, the perfect body, the perfect words. We chase the version of ourselves we believe others will finally accept. Imagine again that small bird from before. You reach for it and it flinches away. You try harder, stretching further, running faster, and the very act of grasping sends it deeper into the trees. Love, peace, worthiness, they all behave the same way. The tighter you cling, the further they drift. I've felt it myself in relationships where my need for reassurance only created distance, in work where my desire to prove myself burned through my joy. Each time, the more I chased, the more invisible the goal became. Buddhism doesn't condemn the longing itself. It invites us to understand it, to turn toward that restlessness and ask, what am I afraid of losing? Or what am I afraid I'll never have? And when you ask sincerely, you might discover that the thing you've been chasing is not love at all. It's the end of the fear that you're unworthy of it. This is why chasing never works, because the chase is born from the belief that you're incomplete. And as long as you carry that belief, no amount of running will ever bring you to rest. There is another path, one where the need to chase dissolves and what you seek begins to come toward you. But to walk it, you must first face the wound that fuels the pursuit. The chase always begins in the same place, with a wound. Not always the kind you can see. Sometimes it's a sentence you heard as a child and never stopped repeating to yourself. Sometimes it's the moment someone you trusted looked away instead of reaching for you. Sometimes it's not even a memory, but a shadow, a faint ache you've carried so long, it feels like part of who you are. We learn early to hide it. We build smiles over it, achievements around it, relationships in front of it, anything to keep the world from noticing. But in the quiet, when the noise fades, it's still there, waiting. Buddhism doesn't tell us to fight this wound or to bury it deeper. It invites us to sit with it, To turn toward it as you would toward a crying child, not to silence it, but to listen. Because the wound isn't your enemy, it's a messenger. It's been calling out again and again, not to shame you, but to be seen. In Japan, there is an art called kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with veins of gold. The break is not hidden, it's illuminated. The object becomes more beautiful for having been broken. This is what happens when we meet our own pain with tenderness instead of resistance. I remember the first time I truly sat with my own wound. No distractions, no clever justifications, just the raw ache in me. At first, it felt unbearable, like stepping into a room filled with smoke. But slowly, something changed. The smoke thinned. I could see its edges, its shape, and I realized it wasn't endless. It was finite. It had a story. And once I heard that story, it no longer ruled me. When we dare to acknowledge our wound, we stop running from it. And when we stop running from it, the chase loses its power. What's left is not weakness, but a strange, quiet strength, the kind that comes from knowing you can face yourself and not turn away. And in that space, where fear has loosened its grip, something else becomes possible, a stillness that doesn't feel empty, but alive. There's a moment after the running stops, after the wound is seen, when silence arrives. Not the awkward kind that makes you scramble for something to say. This is different. This is the kind of silence that feels like the air itself is listening. We often think love must be earned through motion, through proving, giving, chasing. But in the quiet teachings of Buddhism, love is less like a prize and more like a guest. It enters the space you make for it. And the doorway is stillness. Stillness is not an absence. It's a presence so complete that nothing needs to be added. Imagine a pond in the early morning. No ripples, no wind. The moon reflected in perfect clarity. If you reach into the water, you shatter the image. But if you remain, the reflection holds. Love recognizes itself in that stillness. It's drawn to it not because you've trapped it, but because you've stopped frightening it away. In stillness, there's no bargaining, no convincing, no proving. There's only space, and in that space, love can breathe. I learned this during a silent retreat in the mountains. For days, I tried to meditate correctly, sitting straighter, breathing deeper, chasing that perfect moment of peace. But the more effort I poured in, the more restless my mind became. One afternoon, exhausted, I gave up. I let my shoulders drop, my breath do whatever it wanted. And in that surrender it came. Not fireworks, not some grand revelation, just a gentle warmth, as if life itself had placed a hand on my back. For the first time, I wasn't chasing love. I was letting it arrive. Stillness is an invitation. It's the open gate in the garden wall. It's the place where the bird from the forest finally lands, not because you've trapped it, but because you've made a home it wants to return to. And when you've felt that, even once, it begins to change the way you hold the world, and the way the world holds you. When love finally begins to arrive, the temptation is to hold on tighter. We think, now that I have it, I can't let it slip away. And so, without realizing, we begin the chase again, only this time not toward love, but around it. We circle it like a guard afraid of thieves. But the truth is, love doesn't vanish because you loosen your grip. It vanishes when you strangle it. Detachment is not about coldness. It's not withdrawing or pretending you don't care. In the Buddhist sense, detachment means loving without ownership, allowing beauty to exist in its own freedom. Think of the tide. It comes to the shore, leaves its gifts of shells and driftwood, then returns to the sea. If you tried to trap it, you'd kill what makes it alive. Trust is knowing the tide will come back, and that even if it doesn't, the ocean still holds endless beauty. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering. And it's not just clinging to people. We cling to outcomes, identities, moments we wish could last forever. Detachment is the gentle act of opening your palm and saying, I don't need to trap this to treasure it. I learned this when a close friend moved halfway across the world. At first, I was devastated. I thought distance would dissolve our connection, but something surprising happened. Without the constant need to hold her close, I began to trust the space between us. And in that trust, our friendship deepened. When you detach, you stop trying to control the life of the thing you love. You start to witness it with wonder instead of fear. You stop asking, will this last? And start asking, how fully can I be here now? And when trust replaces control, you begin to realize, maybe love isn't something you keep. Maybe it's something you join. Every relationship you've ever had has been a mirror. Some reflect your beauty so clearly you can't help but stand a little taller. Others seem to magnify every flaw, every insecurity you've tried to hide. But mirrors don't choose what they show you. They simply reveal what is already there. This is why love can feel so complicated. We think we're only relating to another person, when in truth, we're also meeting parts of ourselves we didn't know were still alive. The old wound from childhood, the voice that says you're not enough, the longing for approval that never came. Relationships bring these ghosts into the light, not to punish us, but to invite us into healing. Buddhism teaches that all beings are connected like the reflections of the moon in countless bowls of water. Each person you meet offers you a chance to see yourself more clearly, to notice where you cling, where you fear, where you shine. I remember being with someone who adored me in ways I couldn't understand. Instead of feeling safe, I felt uneasy, almost suspicious. And then I saw it. Their love was reflecting back a part of me I had never learned to love myself. It wasn't their affection that frightened me. It was the mirror. The gift of relationships is not that they make you whole, but that they reveal where you believe you are broken. And once you see that, you can begin to meet those places with the same compassion you offer others. When you start to approach relationships this way, something shifts. Every interaction, even the difficult ones, becomes a teacher. Every person a mirror. Some show you the softness you've forgotten. Others, the boundaries you need to honor. And little by little, you stop fearing the reflection because you've begun to trust the face looking back. And from that trust, a deeper connection becomes possible. One that doesn't just change how you love others, but how you walk through the world. There's a tenderness we often reserve for others, a patience, a willingness to forgive, a way of holding space for their mistakes. Yet when it comes to ourselves, that same tenderness vanishes. We replay our missteps like a looped film, each time adding more blame, more shame. We speak to ourselves in tones we'd never use with a friend. And somehow, we expect this self-criticism to make us better. Buddhism teaches that compassion isn't complete until it includes you, that the same boundless kindness you wish for others is meant to flow inward too. Without it, the heart remains divided, gentle toward the world, harsh toward its own home. Compassion toward the self doesn't mean excusing everything you've done. It means seeing the human beneath the action, the tiredness, the fear, the longing that shaped the choice. It means recognizing that your flaws are not evidence of failure, but proof that you are still becoming. I remember sitting with an older monk who had listened quietly to my list of regrets. When I finished, he simply asked, "Would you speak to your younger self the way you speak to yourself now?" I shook my head. "Then why not treat the current you as that same child?" It struck me then. The version of me that made those mistakes didn't need punishment. They needed guidance, understanding, love. And that version of me still lives inside. Self-compassion is the soil where growth takes root. Without it, change becomes a performance, driven by fear of judgment. With it, change becomes a natural blooming, nourished by acceptance. When you finally offer yourself the same care you've been giving away to others, something shifts. You stop trying to prove your worth because you already know it. And in that knowing, the world feels less like a battlefield and more like a place you belong. Self-love is not a grand event. It's not a sudden moment when the clouds part and you forever see yourself in perfect light. It's quieter than that, smaller even. Self-love is built in the choices you make when no one's watching. It's the way you speak to yourself while brushing your teeth. The way you pause before agreeing to something that would stretch you too thin. The way you let yourself rest without earning it. In Buddhism, practice is everything. Not because practice makes you perfect, but because practice makes you present. And presence is where love actually lives. You can't store it up for later. You can only choose it again and again in this moment. I learned this after years of treating self-care like an emergency room, only visiting when I was burned out, broken, or empty. But love, real love, is preventative. It's in the habits that keep your spirit nourished before it starves. Some mornings, my practice is as simple as sitting for 5 minutes, breathing without a goal. Other days, it's cooking myself a meal with the same care I'd give a guest. And sometimes, it's saying no without apology. The point isn't what you do, it's the intention beneath it. Is it an act of maintenance for a machine or an act of reverence for a life? When you love yourself daily, you stop waiting for someone else to make you feel whole. You stop holding your happiness hostage to the approval of others. You realize that your own hands, the ones you use to work, to help, to create, are also the hands that can hold you. And in that holding, even on the hardest days, you carry a reminder. Love is not something you stumble upon. It's something you practice into being. No matter how far we travel into memories of what was or daydreams of what might be, there is always a way home, and home is here. The present moment is the only place where love can actually touch you. Not the love you remember, not the love you hope for. The love that is alive right now, breathing with you in this second. But we forget. We get pulled into loops, the what-ifs, the should-haves, the endless comparisons. And each time the mind wanders further from the body, as if chasing a horizon it can never catch. Buddhism offers a simple invitation: return. Not by force, not by guilt. Just notice you've left and come back. Come back to the feel of your feet on the floor, the way your breath moves in your chest, the small sounds that prove the world is still here, waiting. I once asked a monk how he managed to stay so peaceful. He smiled and said, "I leave the present moment all the time. I just return quickly." That changed everything for me. I stopped expecting myself to be perfectly mindful and instead practiced the art of returning. 100 times a day if needed. And each return was not a failure but a reunion. When you return to now, you step out of the stories that keep you chasing love and into the life where love is already happening. You see the kindness in a stranger's eyes. You taste the sweetness in your tea. You notice the quiet miracle that you are here, alive, at all. And in that noticing, you realize, maybe love was never something to seek. Maybe it was simply something to come back to. We began with a question: why do we chase love? And somewhere along this path, we discovered the truth that love is not ahead of us waiting to be caught. It is here waiting to be noticed. Stillness invited it in. Trust allowed it to stay. Self-compassion gave it a place to grow. And the present moment revealed it was never gone. You are not a seeker in the wilderness anymore. You are the forest. You are the home. You are the one you've been running toward all along. In the quiet, in the breath between thoughts, you can feel it. There is nothing missing. The love you were chasing was the love you already are. If these words have found their way into you, let them be more than just words. Let them become your way of walking, of speaking, of resting. Each step an act of belonging. Each breath a reminder: I am already home. If this journey has spoken to something deep in you, you're welcome to walk further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more reflections, meditations, and quiet truths to guide your path. And when you do, take a moment to pause and remember, the wisdom you seek has always been within.